I'm gonna go first. All right, better code through instrumentation. I'm pretty excited to talk about this because I think it's something that doesn't really get enough play, and I think it can really help your code. And not many people know about it, so that's a bonus. And so the big secret is code responds to music, especially drums for some reason. We don't know why. It's really true. No, it's not true. It's not true at all. You can write code that responds to music, but code itself doesn't respond to music. Okay, no more jokes. So when I say instrumentation, I'm not talking about musical instruments. I'm really talking about stuff like this. Gauges, things that let you observe the system, but that doesn't really affect the way the system works. So a use case for this is maybe you want to generate data to go on a dashboard so you can monitor your system and see what's happening inside of it. And there's things like New Relic and the Librado Rails plugin that will show you very deep system level things about how many database queries are going through like that. But they don't show you stuff that are specific to your domain. They don't really tell you so much about what's going on within your domain logic. It's just about very low-level system stuff. So like in this one in the upper left graph here is showing how many photos have been uploaded to a site. And you don't get that right out of the box with New Relic or something like that. You have to take steps to figure out how to get that data. And yeah, you could query for it and do all kinds of things, but you really don't want to spend a lot of time doing that. You want to focus on what makes your app unique and let data gathering and data visualization be handled by somebody else, like, say, Librado in this case. So if you wanted to capture some data with Librado, you might start with an action in your controller where these photos are getting uploaded. And before you make any changes, it's going to look something like this. You're going to create a photo, and then you're going to respond. And so your first draft might be, well, let's just jam in a line that tells Librado to increment a counter so that we can keep track of that. And that's okay. It's not great. There are a couple of issues with this. One is that it violates the single responsibility principle. Now your controller not only is responsible for taking HTTP arguments and turning it into a domain object, it's also now responsible for telling a third party that you've just created this domain object. And so it's starting to get messy, and if you have several different services that you're trying to notify, it gets messy real fast. And this also complicates development and testing, because to even run this locally or inside of your test suite, now you need to have Librado actually configured so that when you call Librado, it doesn't raise an error and say, oh, I don't have an API key, so I can't do the thing. And then it's even worse if you're using something like WebMock, which is preventing your test suite from making HTTP calls. Now WebMock is going to gripe about, oh, Librado tried to make an HTTP call that we weren't expecting, so you need to mock the call, and now you've got all this weird stuff in your test that really doesn't have much to do with your domain logic. This is just about keeping track of what's happening. If you turn off Librado, it's not going to break your system. It's just going to give you less visibility into it. And so having that intermingled with your domain code isn't really the best solution. So the second approach that a lot of people take is in your model. You add an after create hook so that the callback is now in the model. It's not in the controller. Some people think this is better. It's, maybe better if you like to have fat models and skinny controllers. That's a thing. Some people subscribe to that. But this still violates the single responsibility principle. Now your model is responsible for notifying a third-party service in addition to being responsible for getting data in and out of the database. And you still have all the same problems with development and testing. Environment variables, HTTP calls being made that you don't expect. So it doesn't really give us a lot of improvement. So in the third draft, you might have a photo creation service that conceptually is supposed to create a photo and do all of the associated things with it. So you might just, jam your Librado call in there. And that's all right. It's a little bit better on SRP. It's still not great, but you still have all the problems with development and testing. So what if we didn't have to find a place inside of our existing code base to jam this Librado call? What if we could do it somewhere outside of our main application code so that as you're reading the code to understand what the system does, you never even see Librado. It's not part of your core system. It's an add-on. It's instrumentation that helps you see what's happening. So this is where active support notifications comes in. So what you can do is set up an initializer that might be at config initializers, instrumentation RB, and you subscribe to an event that you want to listen to. So in this case, you would subscribe to SQL.ActiveRecord. And so what's going to happen is anytime ActiveRecord makes a SQL call of any sort, this little block of code is going to get called with some arguments. Active support notifications offers a convenience object called event that you just pass it the arguments, and it's going to give you a nice event that will tell you things like, when did this call begin? When did it end? What was the elapsed wall time for it? What kind of arguments, what was the context of this call? Things like that. So to continue with our example, you might do something like this. You might say, if the event payload name is equal to photo create, let's call Librado and tell them that we've just created a photo. You could generalize this. You probably want to tell Librado about every object that ever gets created in your system. And so instead of investigating the name, you would just look to see, does it contain create? And if so, let's just post that directly to Librado. There is one caveat here in that this code, as I've written it here, will only work in Rails 5.2.0 or higher. This pull request right here is one that I actually landed in Rails. It was my first Rails contribution in September. I was pretty excited about that, but I was wanting to do something exactly like this, and previously the payload name was always just SQL. It didn't matter what was created, what was updated, what was deleted, it was always SQL, but for some reason when an object was loaded, that one would be descriptive. So like when you would go to look up a photo, it would say photo load, but when you created a photo, the payload name would be SQL. So I got this PR landed that makes them more descriptive, and so in 5.2.0 and higher, the payload name is going to be descriptive of what it does, so you can start using photo create, photo update, that kind of thing. So if you try to use it in anything less than 5.2.0 and you try this code, it's not going to work. So comments on this approach. This is better on SRP because we've completely removed the notification of third-party services from our core domain logic. It's now something that is kind of orthogonal to our domain logic. We've kind of plugged it in on the side as a thing that we want to happen, but it's not something that our system depends on happening. As that last example, as it's written, is still kind of complicated on development and testing because the system is still going to try to notify Librado anytime that a SQL event comes through. So the way that I like to handle this is wrapping the initializer in a conditional. So we check to see, do we actually have Librado credentials that is going to make it such that Librado can work? And so what you can do is in your test env file, you just don't have any Librado credentials. So when you're testing, Librado never comes into the picture. If you're doing local development and you're not currently interested in debugging your Librado implementation, you cannot have any Librado credentials in your environment, and it's not going to happen. So this is entirely dependent on, do we actually need to run Librado or not, and it's still not polluting the code. So that's just as good as it was on SRP and is an improved story on development and testing. Another cool thing about active support notifications is that you can create custom events. So if there are methods inside of your code that you think you might want to watch and notify Librado about, you don't need to cram that directly into that method. You can fire a notification and then do the same kind of a trick. So somewhere in your code, you would have something that looks kind of like this. You'd have a payload of data that you want to pass to the instrumentation call. And then around the code that you want to instrument, you would say active support notifications.instrument. And then you give it an event name and the payload that you want to be made available to the event code. So the notification is sent when the block returns. So at the end of that block, your notification is going to be fired. Active support notifications will capture the start time and the end time for you, so you don't have to do that. It's going to calculate the elapsed wall time for you, and it's going to generate a unique ID so that if you need to, if you need item potency on these calls, you have a unique ID that you can make sure that you're not duplicating calls to Librado. And that's it. That's all I got. Does anybody have questions? Yes, sir. Do they what? Oh, so the question is, do the notifications happen in a separate thread? And I believe that the answer is no. And so for bonus points, usually what I would do is, instead of trying to tell Librado right then, I would have a background job in Sidekick or like Factory that Jeff is going to tell us about here in a few minutes, so that instead of calling to Librado directly then, you just schedule a job and say, hey, when you got a minute, tell Librado that this thing happened. And so that will kind of decouple the, completely decouple the call at runtime from your code. But as I had shown it there, I believe it happens in the same thread as the main execution. What happens if there's an exception inside of the handler for a notification? That's a good question that I don't believe I know the answer to off the top of my head. Does anybody know? Probably nothing good, if I had to guess. Like, it's Jeff. So the question was, if I understand correctly, is that on this slide, like instead of checking for environment variables, what if you just said if environment is not equal to test or not equal to production? That's a fine way to do it. I know that a lot of people do like to test directly on what the name of the environment is. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm a bigger fan of allowing the environment to kind of dictate how it's going to work based on what is available. I just find that with those kind of things, if you then go add a staging environment, you're going to end up having to come touch the code and say, if it's production or staging 2 or staging 3, and that gets out of hand real quick. And this way, if you just say it's looking for an environment variable, it's easy to toggle this on and off in any given environment without actually having to touch code. So that's usually where I go with environment variables. Anybody else? Going once, twice? All right, that's it. Next up is Jeff French to talk about Factory, a background processing framework.